Hey, I'm Lissa, and I'm so glad you're here. That's why I showed up in my best denim for you. Now, it may not look like the CEO that you were expecting, but it's on purpose because on this training, we are going to start thinking like wise farmers, aka wise CEOs. And just so you know, every time I use that word in my world, that means a Christ empowered operator of the business and life that God has given you. Girl, we're going to roll up our sleeves and we're going to dig into God's word, the seven laws of the harvest, so that you will know exactly where, when, and how to invest your time to reap the roti, return on time invested that you're praying for. So, are you ready for a timely truth? Here's your first one. Focus on the root, and the fruit will take care of itself. Did you know that God desires fruitfulness in your life and business? It's true, but He doesn't just want a handful or even a basketful. He's looking to produce exponentially abundant fruitfulness through you. Why? Well, John 15:5, verses 5 through 8 tells us, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. And then get this. By this, my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. That's because your fruitfulness is not about a look at me, it's about a look at Him. Because He is the source of the seeds in your hands, in the fields that He's called you to plant in this season of your life and business. And not only is God the supplier, He's the multiplier. In other words, He is the one who brings the hundredfold growth. But here's the thing, you and me, we still have to do our part, the sowing. So let's start by defining some growth terms. Are you ready? The first one is sow. Sow is a verb, and it literally means to plant seeds for growth, as in what a farmer does when it's planting season in late spring or early summer. But I love how the secondary definition goes even deeper. So, to set a process in motion. You see, if that farmer doesn't plant the seeds, no growth will happen and no harvest will be filling his barns. The same is true in your business. Think about your minutes, your hours, your days, your weeks, your months, your seasons, your years as your seed. If you invest time wisely, you will set in motion the process of growth, right? The other growth term we need to define is reap. Reap is also a verb, which means to gather in what has grown. Hence, the time in the fall when the lights on those tractors are on till late at night to bring in the harvest before the winter comes. And check out the secondary definition, to harvest the results. In other words, the roti, return on time invested, of all that time. Again, totally applicable to business as well. Because if you've planted seeds in the soil, you'd be a fool not to harvest. And the same is true with your business. If you invest time in the right things in your business, more on that in a minute, you would be a fool to not be looking for abundant results when it's due season. Am I right? So, if we are looking to reap a harvest of abundance in our business as CEOs, we need to start thinking like strategic farmers who don't just merely observe the fields around us, but who leverage the seven laws of the harvest to reap the abundant harvest that we're praying for. So, you might be wondering, what are the laws of the harvest, Lissa? Well, I'm so glad you asked. They come from Paul's letters to the Galatians in Galatians 6, 7 through 9. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. You see, just like the other natural laws that God established at creation that are always at work, like the law of gravity, we can't get around the laws of the harvest. But if we embrace them, we will benefit from them. That's why no laws are more important or significant to us as CEOs than these seven principles that govern the harvest that we reap, whether in faith, in life, or in our business. So here's your next timely truth. With God, there's always an abundant roti. But warning, this is not a prosperity gospel where if you do X for Y length of time, you are guaranteed Z results. No, it's all a step of faith as we not only receive the seeds He's entrusted to us, but we follow His lead to plant them in the fields He's given us, and we trust Him in the timing of the harvest. But here's the thing, it's an active faith because we play a necessary part. in both the sowing and the reaping, and he's the one that brings the growth. Farmers got to live by faith, and so do we as Christ-empowered operators of our life and business. So let's dig into the 7 laws of the harvest and how each one applies to your time and Roti, especially in your business. Are you ready? Okay, law of the harvest number 1. We reap what we sow. I know, it seems like a no-brainer. Lisa, everyone knows that. Believers and non-believers, business owners and non-business owners alike. But have you really taken the time to go below the surface? When we do our part to sow the seeds he's given us, in time, we will reap a harvest. Now, each of these laws can work in the direction we want to grow, as well as in the direction we don't. Because if we never do the sowing, or we randomly sow our seed, it will impact our reaping, aka our results, right? That's because reaping is a natural consequence of sowing. We reap if we sow, and we don't reap if we don't sow. So, how does law of the harvest number 1 apply to your time and Roti? Well, it all starts with having a CEO time perspective by first recognizing the abundance of 24 hours that he has entrusted to you each day, and then not keeping it safely stored away so it doesn't get away from you, nor running around randomly scattering time with this market strategy, that sales system, or another offer stack, but instead intentionally and wisely investing the time he's given you to grow the life and business he's called you to. Because, girl, you will reap what you sow. Law of the harvest number 2 is kind of similar. We reap the same kind as we sow. Again, this should be obvious. If you sow wheat, you'll reap wheat. If you sow soybeans, you'll reap soybeans. If you sow apple seeds, you'll reap apples. You would be a fool to think that by sowing corn, you could expect anything else, right? Because there is a direct correspondence between what is sown and what is reaped. So be warned if you are sowing what you don't want, because your harvest will be disappointing. But be encouraged if you're sowing what you do want, because according to the first 2 laws of the harvest, you will reap a harvest, and it will be of the same kind that you sowed. So how does this apply to your business time and Roti? When you consistently invest time putting out engaging content, making new connections, having sales conversations, all to sow into your best client or customer, it will lead to conversions of more clients or customers, because that's the natural consequence, right? But the opposite is also true. If you spend time chasing all the squirrels and shiny objects in your inbox or your news feeds, you can't expect to see clients or customers coming in on the daily. You'll just have an organized inbox or a long news feed, because that's the natural consequence of sowing time in that way. And this is why many busyness owners, myself included back in the day, think they're doing a lot of productive things with their time, but they're not seeing the profitability, aka the results they're praying for. But when it comes to sowing or investing your time to reap an abundant Roti, you need to pay attention to what you're sowing, because that is what you're going to reap. If you sow busyness, you will for sure reap a busyness, because that is how the laws of the harvest work. Law of the harvest number 3, we reap in a different season than we sow. This one has everything to do with time, because there's time between the sowing and the reaping. Everyone knows, farmers and CEOs alike, that the harvest never comes immediately after planting. Why? Because the harvest comes in due time, and rarely before, right? Otherwise, the harvest would be less than. So expect an in-between time of waiting. But like I said earlier, that doesn't mean it's a passive waiting. It's an active waiting of tending and nurturing what was planted, so that it maximizes the access to what it needs to grow, like sunlight, water, and nutrients. And no matter how long the time is between, the waiting requires faith in the Lord of the harvest, that even when it looks like nothing is happening, everything is happening underground, and the harvest will come in his appointed season. So how does law of the harvest number 3 apply to your business time and Roti? Great question. When was the last time you got an immediate result from an action you took? Sometimes it feels like that happens, like a client who found your podcast, followed your links from one exposure to the next, and signed up for your high-level program all in the same day. But technically, there was still time in between. And that was actually the harvest of time you invested days, weeks, months, or even years ago. But in the day-to-day of business, as CEOs, we know that we need to invest time connecting, nurturing, inviting, following up over some length of time before we reap that new client, right? That's why it's important to not just plant one seed in one time of the year or put all your hope in that one seed, but to continually plant seeds in your business, because as some are going in the ground, others are being tended while others are being harvested. This is also why CEOs don't just look at their current results. They look back to what they were doing, what they were sowing and tending 90 days ago, because the results you're seeing today are from what you did back then. Why? Because law of the harvest number 3 tells us that growth takes time, sometimes more, sometimes less, but nevertheless, there's always time between the sowing and the reaping. All right, law of the harvest number 4. We reap more than we sow. This one has everything to do with God's part in the growth process, and it's one of the most important truths about sowing and reaping. If it were not true, there'd be little to no harvest, so no one would aspire to be a farmer because it wouldn't be worth their time. Think about it. It's the fact that in farming, one does not equal one that keeps the farmer going. And the principle that when a seed is planted in good soil, it produces, or rather reproduces, many times more. Did you know that a good wheat harvest is around 10 to 20 fold? Now, I'm not much of a farmer, but I do know that when I plant one tomato seed or one corn seed or one apple seed, I will get more than one tomato, one ear of corn, or one apple, right? Because God created the growth process to be multiplication, which is where we get the concept of the hundredfold harvest that I'll share about in a minute. So how does law of the harvest number 4 apply to your business time in Roti? Well, the concept that we reap more than we sow applies to business owners in that our small, consistent efforts will multiply into significant results over time. It's called the compound effect. When you have wise investments of time in connections, collaborations, even high converting content, and that will lead to exponential growth, just as a single seed produces an abundant harvest. Or one well-nurtured client relationship could lead to many more referrals, partnerships, ongoing revenue streams. Or creating one high-value offer could serve hundreds of clients without requiring 100 times more time or effort. That's why we want to be good stewards of finances, systems, and client relationships because it compounds over time, and it's going to bring greater influence and income for us as business owners. However, remember, the same principle also applies negatively. If a business owner sows distraction, inconsistency, or burnout, girl, the harvest is going to be a lot of frustration and stagnation, and plenty of it. All right, law of the harvest number 5. We reap in proportion to what we sow. Wait, doesn't that sound like a contradiction to what we just talked about in law of the harvest number 4? No, because both are true at the same time. We do always reap more than we sow, and we do always reap in proportion to what we sow. Both laws have to do with quantity. However, law of the harvest number 4 has to do with God's part, the multiplication, the hundredfold growth that only He can bring from what we sow. And law of the harvest number 5 has to do with our part, the sowing the seeds that He's entrusted to us to set the growth process in motion. Perhaps you're familiar with 2 Corinthians 9:8. He who sows sparingly should also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully shall also reap bountifully. So the more we sow, the more we reap. That's why we want to sow the right kind of seeds, because we are going to reap more of that kind. But notice, law of the harvest number 4, God's part, His abundant growth part, doesn't happen until we do law of the harvest number 5, our part of giving Him more to work with. So how does law of the harvest number 5 apply to your business time in Roti? Well, here's where as CEOs, we get to lean into His kingdom math. Because in the kingdom, it's not addition, it's multiplication. And better yet, exponents. Did you know that 100-fold is a 10,000% dividend? What if that was the kind of math that described your return on time invested in business? It can be when we seek Him first and do our part of generously sowing the seeds He's entrusted to us in the fields He's called us to, and depend on Him to do His part of bringing the growth that's bigger than what we could do on our own. Because together, we will reap an abundant harvest. That's why in doing our part, we don't want to fall prey to randomness, spending time in random places for random reasons. We want to intentionally and generously invest time in the key areas of our business, like our CEO believing, creating, connecting, inviting, nurturing, and serving. So that way, God can bring the 100-fold kind of harvest that could only be from Him for His glory as we serve clients and customers. Law of the harvest number 6. We reap if we protect what we sow and don't give up. Do you know what the number one mistake a farmer or a CEO can make after taking all that time to plant seeds in their fields? There are actually 2 mistakes that are tied together. Mistake number 1 is failing to protect what you want to grow by leaving it open to anything and anyone. In the farmer's case, from Bambi to weeds to high school kids on a 4-wheeler joyride. What would happen if you took all that time to plant your really big field, only to not keep out the varmints and the vagrants. Do you think it might have an effect on the harvest if it's not protected? In other words, if you don't put healthy boundaries around it or take the time to remove what's unwanted popping up inside it? The same is true with mistake number 2, failing to protect what you want to grow until it's due season. Ain't no farmer going to put in all that work, taking all that time to weed, repair fences, only to walk away before harvest time. You better believe they're going to stick it out till the end, because then otherwise they will reap a big fat zero for all that work and time. So how does Law of the Harvest number 6 apply to your business time and roadie? Well, since there are 2 parts to this law, there are 2 things that every wise CEO must do. First, protect what she's growing, and second, keep persevering. First, how do you protect what you're growing? Well, by creating healthy boundaries around your time to both give what you want to grow the space it needs, like time for deep CEO focus work, time for connection and collaboration, time for laying out that new marketing strategy or sales message, and also to keep out what will take away from the growth, like the squirrels and the shiny objects, the distractions and the interruptions, and all those random tasks that we think of at random times. And what about protecting against the second threat, giving up? When you can't see the growth yet, but only see the difficulties, it may be tempting to give up by running off to another coach or another platform or another group. But girl, you will just miss out on what God is doing under the surface. He is bringing the growth when the roots are down deep. So here's my time strategist advice. When you make a CEO decision to sow seeds in a certain area of your business, don't get impatient and run off too quickly. Commit to stick around long enough to see the harvest when the time is right. All right, here we are. Law of the Harvest number 7. We reap this year's harvest from what we sow. Or said another way, we cannot do anything about last year's harvest, but we can about this year's. So here is the reminder to be present to the present and the purpose of the time that's right in front of you in this season. Don't shoulda, woulda, coulda about the past or worry over the what ifs and what next of the future. A wise farmer and a wise CEO knows that wallowing about yesterday or last week or last month or last year is not going to bring any more harvest than will worrying about tomorrow, next week, next month, or next year. A wise farmer focuses on sowing wisely in the present, the only time he can do anything about right now. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't plan for the future, because all good farmers think ahead in a good way, because what they sow today impacts the harvest they will have tomorrow. So, how does Law of the Harvest number 7 apply to your business time, roadie? Well, a wise CEO understands that the results she has today are the consequences of how she's invested time up till now. So no sense wasting time playing the what if game about years gone by. What if I had jumped on that new platform or attended that big event or made that bold pitch? Because nothing can change that now, and planting seeds of regret will not grow what you want. Neither will worrying about years from now, how the algorithm might change, who might be at the event, or the response you might get to a big offer. Because fear and doubt are just weeds for today. Girl, the only time that you can do anything about is the season you are in. So pause, look around at what it's time for, and focus on investing wisely right now. All right, so look at you. If you are still with me, you are not just a wise farmer, you are a wise CEO. Because you're not only wanting to master the concept of sowing and reaping, you're wanting to leverage the 7 laws of the harvest as you invest time in your business for greater roadie, aka your results. But before we do that, may I show you a very short verse that you've probably skipped over just like I did. That is, until I started looking at scripture for what God has to say about fruitfulness and abundance and 100-fold harvest. It's found in Genesis 26:12. But first, I want to give you some context. It's in the story of Isaac, you know, the son of Abraham, the one who God promised to multiply his seeds as numerous as the stars in the sky and sand in the sea, and through whom God promised to bless all nations of the earth. Isaac trusted God, even though he could not see the abundance yet. His family was not a big group of people, and they didn't even have their own land. But God told him to go and settle among the Philistines. Now, do you know anything about the Philistines? Yes, that will be a future enemy. Remember Goliath? And he told them to go settle in their land. I can only imagine how much they didn't like it then or down the road, because it was part of the promised land that would one day belong to the Israelites. So now that you know the background, I'm sure you can imagine how my jaw dropped when I read verse 12. And Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. Wow. It would have been easy to just pass over that one verse, but there's so much in it. Because in case you didn't notice, that's a miraculous, only God kind of harvest. From wandering around to sowing in a land that's not yours, not having all the tools you need, to reaping a 100-fold harvest in just 12 months' time. That's what I once said about my business. That Lissa sowed time in her business and reaped in the same year a 100-fold because she was doing it with God. Don't you? And notice, it follows all 7 laws of the harvest. Isaac did his part of sowing and trusted God to do his part of growing and multiplying. And then Isaac reaped the 100-fold kind of harvest that only God could bring. In fact, listen to the next few verses in Genesis 26, verses 13 and 14. It says, "The Lord blessed him, and the man became very rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him." Now, our goal in business is not to create envy in the hearts of those watching us on Instagram, but to call such attention to the abundance of our harvest that believers and non-believers alike say, "How did she do that?" And we can say, "It's all him." So here's another timely truth. According to Ephesians 3:20, he is the one who does exceedingly abundantly beyond all that we could ask or imagine for his glory. Girl, that's why I say with God, there's always an abundant roti. Now, was all Isaac's hard work what made that kind of 100-fold growth happen? No, he did his part of the planting, but as Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians 3, verses 6 through 8, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. Did you hear it? Reap what we sow, reap the same kind as we sow, in season, in excess, in proportion, if we protect it and are present to the season we're in. Doesn't that sound familiar? It should. It's the 7 laws of the harvest. So our part is to sow the seeds, to start the growth process, and actively wait by faith in the in-between season. But God is the one who brings the growth and the harvest in his due time. And that growth process is accelerated when we seek him and faith-centered support. That's why you need the 4 CEO time essentials. Now, essentials are not nice to haves, they're must-haves. Why? Because you want to invest your time wisely in order to scale your business roti 100-fold. So, what are the 4 CEO essentials? I'm so glad you asked. CEO schedules, CEO systems, and CEO strategies tied together with CEO stewardship. You see, everything in your business starts with your time, because once you leverage your time using biblical truth, like the 7 laws of the harvest, along with these CEO essentials, you will be paving the way to not only scaling your business roti to the 100-fold level, but also scaling your team to the 100-fold level too. So, what is your next best CEO step? I'm so glad you asked. Start building the CEO essentials with a productive and profitable CEO private podcast. Don't worry, you won't be out there plowing the rocky ground on your own, because I will be with you every step of the way. This is your perfect next step, because now that you understand how important your time and roti are in business and how to leverage the 7 laws of the harvest, it's time to get the CEO essentials in place to reap the 100-fold roti that you're praying for. And the beauty is, this framework works if you're already a rocking 6 or multi-6-figure earner, or if you're well on your way. When you listen to this private podcast, you're going to get back 5 hours this week. And girl, that is just the start as you learn the secret to productivity is not on your to-do list, how to double your results with one simple shift, and the key to a 10,000% productivity increase. And no, that's not a typo. Plus, there's so much more inside the private podcast, because your results in business have everything to do with focusing on your time and roti above all else. And you can do it on the go. Doesn't that sound like a good roti return on time invested? Girl, I can't wait to help you get back 5 hours this week using the 4 CEO essentials. And this is just the beginning, because the growth that you've already experienced here is going to be accelerated when you access the Productive and Profitable CEO private podcast at redeemhertime.com/hours, or use the link or QR on the last page of this guide. I cannot wait to see your 100-fold results.